I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about Eberron. And I've been a big fan of Eberron. I was playing D&D during the third edition era. In fact, I had come back to D&D after wandering further afield when 3rd edition was released in 2000. There's a couple reasons why I had quit playing D&D. Some of them had nothing to do with the game itself. I was just busier doing other things, and a lot of my hobbies had slipped and I wasn't spending as much time on them. But part of it is that I never really loved D&D itself. I loved the concept of role-playing in a fantasy world. D&D was never quite what I wanted, and I was always struggling to make it do what I really wanted it to do, because what I wanted it to do really wasn't very compatible with what Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, or pretty much any of the developers for that matter had wanted it to do. Eberron did a lot of things that I liked, and of the published settings, that official published settings, it's probably one of my favorite, because it isn't too far away from D&D as you expect it to be, that it's really weird, but it's far enough away that it doesn't feel too bland. That said, I always felt like in many ways Eberron was held back by the fact that it was a D&D setting, when it really was kind of reaching towards something else and not able to get it because it was D&D. So a number of years ago, I kind of came up with the idea of remixing Eberron to make it a little bit more like what I wanted it to be. And it was a very light touch at that point. I just discussed it kind of high level, some things that I thought would be good to change. Later, I rediscovered that post on my blog and came up with, I said, I'm going to revisit this a little bit more and maybe give a little bit more detail around this. I'm actually now on my fourth time that I've visited the Eberron Remixed, and I've come quite a long ways since I started and have remixed it more thoroughly than I initially had started, and it's really kind of a different type of thing now than it is in print in a lot of ways. And I'm going to do a little series of YouTube videos where I talk about what I've done. I actually have a website for it, which I'll put in the description, but I also want to talk through some of the stuff that I did. And I'm not going to talk too much about how I got to where I was and exactly what I did along the way. Rather, I'm going to talk kind of more about where I am right now with this. And what I came up with after a while, as I started remixing a little bit more thoroughly, is I needed some guiding principles. I already kind of had one or two, this is what I don't really like, and this is what I don't think really works. But I needed to kind of put more firm guiding principles in place so I could make sure that I was a little more purposeful in what I was remixing. The first guiding principle, Eberron's high concept, of course, was a swashbuckling game of daring do and exploration, a kind of hybrid of Raiders of the Lost Ark and a bunch of noir influences. So yeah, kind of pulp, classic pulp adventure like Doc Savage or Raiders of the Lost Ark, mixed with classic noir influences like something Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler would write, except put in D&D. Putting it in D&D as a setting was fine. Putting it in D&D as a game didn't ever work, especially in 3rd edition when it came out. Now, I haven't played any editions of D&D beyond 3.5. I never played 4E. It went exactly the wrong direction from my already dissatisfaction with 3.5. After playing for many years, I became very dissatisfied with the system. 4E went exactly the wrong direction. 5E probably came more close to what I wanted, but by that point I had already kind of moved on and just wasn't interested. The setting book I have is the 3.5 edition original Eberron campaign setting. And as I've been going through this, I've been going through that setting book, going chapter by chapter, and saying, what do I need to remix here in this chapter? Whereas before I had kind of just lightly touched on some high points and high concepts. So this is a much more thorough remixing, but again, the tone and the feel just didn't work. 3.5 is a very static, cautious, grid-based tactical combat, and it just didn't lend itself to any type of swashbuckling action at all. Combat was not exciting in 3.5. It was even less exciting in 4th edition. But it was absolutely wrong. So you kind of need, and action points as an extra D6 every once in a while was thoroughly inadequate to address that problem. So the first thing to remix is it's got to be in a different system. I don't necessarily care what system it is. Personally, I lean towards rules light systems. I'm kind of an old-fashioned guy. I'm not old school, but I'm old-fashioned, and I definitely appreciate the tone, the vibe, the expectation of how the game is to be run that was present in original D&D before first edition, before basic, kind of OD&D, except fix it so it's not so nonsensical and random and all over the place. But certainly that vibe of play, that type of play is what I want, is a little wild and woolly. GM rulings are much more important than rules because it doesn't give you a lot of rules and it expects you to just figure it out and expects you to listen to your GM. This is not a system that is designed to insulate you from bad GMs like 3rd edition kind of was. I don't think 3rd edition succeeded in that goal because I think that that's a ludicrous goal and I don't think that you can succeed in it. I think the only way to have a good game is with a good GM and good players where you're on the same page about what you want out of the game. Now you can have an adequate game without some of those, maybe, but that's the best you can get. So rather than shooting for some kind of lowest common denominator, I said, look, I'm going to go for a rules light, old D&D style system that can accommodate as much swashbuckling action as you like, or it can accommodate anything else you like as well, and leave it to you to make the system work for you. The system I've actually picked is Microlight 20, and but that's neither here nor there. There's lots of other systems that could work. The next concept, guiding principle, I guess. I've come over the years to appreciate the wisdom Gary Gygax had, which he borrowed from most of the sword and sorcery authors that he was himself writing a pastiche of having much more humanocentric settings. I do not like the idea of tons and tons of races running around in large numbers. That said, my version of Eberron Remixed has almost as many races as Eberron does. However, the numbers are dramatically lower, and they're much more rare and sometimes even exotic, whereas the numbers of humans as a percentage of the total population are greatly increased. In Breland, for example, where humans, I don't remember offhand, I don't think they even have a majority, but if they do, they barely. I think they have a plurality. I've increased it to, somewhere in the high 80% of the population is human. And Breland is one of the more cosmopolitan nations, even so. So many of the other nations have even more humans. Even nations like Valinor are largely populated by humans. And, the overlords are the elves. Well, I'll get to that later. But the overlords would be the elves. They came from Arenal, conquered that land of Valinor. But it wasn't empty, and they didn't just populate it with their own people. There were already humans living there, and they now rule over them as an overcast. But there's still more humans that live there than elves, by far, in fact. The next thing that needs to change as a guiding principle is any hint of wokeness and social justice has to go. Now, I realize both of those terms were not in general use in 2003 when Eberron was written, but there are a few items here and there that kind of hew to it. One of them is the frankly rather insulting treating men and women as if they're interchangeable widgets and there's no difference between them. I think that's absurd. I think it's off-putting to see women who aren't feminine, who pretend to be men. I think it's worse than off-putting. It's downright repugnant to see men who act like women. And I just don't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, for thousands of years, for all of recorded history until the delusional age in which we live in now, everybody knew that men and women were different. What does this mean? It means, among other things, that a lot of these action hero characters that are women will not be women, they'll be men. We'll just swap the gender and maybe change the name a little. It means that, other things too that kind of pretend like there's no such thing as human biodiversity, they have to go. It's a real thing, guys. I don't care what you think. I don't care how it makes you feel. But people are different. They're not the same, and they shouldn't be. And I don't want to have anything to do with it. It also means that Thrain and the Church of the Silver Flame is going to need to see some major changes, because the Church of the Silver Flame is very obvious a stand-in for Christianity. And so, of course, it has typical woke perspectives on Christianity, like, oh my gosh, so oppressive, and, crap like that. We're not doing any of that. The Church of the Silver Flame, in fact, won't exist at all. And neither will the sovereign host, for that matter. If the Church of the Silver Flame is supposed to be a stand-in for Christianity, screw it. I'm putting actual Christianity in. People are just going to be Christians for the most part. Now, that whether they're faithful in the practice of their religion or not is one thing, but nominally almost everybody on Corvair is a Christian. However, I'm an American, not a European, and American-style Christianity is not like European-style Christianity. And that was one of the main reasons that the first Americans came to America, to get away from the way Europeans did their religion. So there's no big centralized church. There's no fantasy Vatican. There's no hierarchy like that. We have much more local and decentralized type of churches. Kind of like, if you drove around when I was a kid in the 80s in the American South, there's tons of little local Baptist church, Presbyterian church, Episcopalian, whatever they were. Baptist and Presbyterian seemed to be the most common. And they had their pastor. Their pastor was trained in some university, but he didn't really, report to anybody. I mean, they get together and they have conclaves and conferences and whatnot, but there's no hierarchy. There's just local pastors and their local congregations. I actually don't think religion's going to play much of a big role in this. Anyway, I tend to find that any discussion of religion in fantasy role-playing becomes a misplaced opportunity for people to try and hash out their half-baked and uninformed opinions about social and political issues, and frankly, I'd just rather not mess with it. So I'm de-emphasizing it. Thrain in particular is going to see a major change, obviously, as part of the remixing process, because it isn't interesting as it is anyway. The fourth guiding principle. Eberron was designed as a setting where everything from D&D had a place, or at least had a potential place. Because of this, it sometimes lacks coherency, because D&D itself doesn't have any coherency. And that's fine, because it's just a whole ton of options. But if you make Eberron and design it in such a way that everything from D&D has to be able to fit, and most things from D&D are literally designed to fit and actually make an appearance of some sort or another, then it becomes a little bit of an incoherent mess. I have no problem cutting things out if I don't think they fit, and I don't care how iconic they are to D&D. For example, I cannot imagine ever doing anything with a Beholder, which is a very iconic D&D monster, but does it fit at all with the concept of Eberron? I actually don't really think so, and I don't really like the concept anyway. So that's an example of something I'm not going to have. There will be a lot more, but I just set that out as a guiding principle. I don't mind being ruthless in my elimination of iconic D&D elements if they don't fit. And the final guiding principle, Eberron is very big. The remixing project is going to be relatively light in terms of details. When I go through a chapter in the Eberron campaign setting, I will write maybe a page worth of text about how I'm remixing it, and for many places I won't even write that much. Although there's one or two chapters where I'll write more than that, because, like the different regions, for example. Because I want to refer you to the Eberron campaign setting as much as possible, and I will be talking about where I differ and referring you to what's already there if I'm not changing it. So it's going to be relatively light on detail. I'm not going to try and get involved in trying to come up with a lot of detail. In general, you don't need a ton of detail until you're actually preparing to run a game. So I'm just not going to do it. The last thing, which isn't necessarily a guiding principle, but it was certainly the impetus behind the final and most dramatic and drastic of the remixing efforts, is I'm not just translating Eberron into a new system, Microlight 20, because there are Microlight systems that are deliberately designed. In fact, the game itself was deliberately designed to be a rules light iteration, a super rules light iteration of D20. And so it plays pretty much exactly like D&D, except with all the rules detail. So I could have translated it into Microlight very faithfully. But what I actually got excited about doing, and the whole reason that I'm revisiting this in the first place, is that rather than translating it into just any Microlight system, I'm translating it into my specific Microlight system, which I designed for my specific setting. Now you may be saying, well, why would you do that? It's designed for your setting. It's not designed for Eberron. Yeah, that's true. But then again, I think the whole concept of trying to translate it into this other system is what makes it interesting to me. One of the things that is very different about that is that I don't have a lot of the D&D races, and I do have, in fact, different D&D races instead. Or, I say D&D races, I have different races that would be comparable, I guess, maybe to the D&D races. So it's a different kind of, it's a very specific rule set, and it has different races, it has a different magic system. D&D's magic is often considered Vancian, although I'm not 100% sure that that's accurate, but that's what people say anyway. The rule set for my system is also based on an older pulpy fiction tradition, but it's probably more fair to call it Lovecraftian rather than Vancian. Now that obviously implicates a somewhat different tone. If it's got a Lovecraftian magic system, then chances are my Eberron Remixed is going to be darker than Eberron in print, and I think that that's probably true. So anyway, I don't want this to get too long. I will start doing some more details in additional videos in this series as I do them, but I just want to introduce you to it, just lay out those guiding principles, and hopefully you find it interesting. If not, I do, so I'm going to do it anyway. See you later.